Hi guys, welcome back to the third episode of The Apple. We're your hosts Esther and Amir.
Hello. Before we get into the podcast, a viewer's discretion is advised. Today's conversation will be talking about IPV, intimate partner violence, substance abuse, physical abuse, and emotional abuse. If any of this content is triggering, please be advised.
We have two very special guests. They're not students, but these are faculty professors. So would you guys like to introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Dr. Tara Mantler, and I'm an assistant prof in the School of Health Studies. I think it's funny that you say we're not students, because actually both of us were students here at one point, but not anymore.
And I'm Professor Katie Shillington, and I'm a faculty member here in the School of Health Studies as well.
Welcome, guys. We are very excited to have you. The conversation today is a very important one. We wanted to give you guys a platform to speak about this because it doesn't get the limelight it deserves.
Yeah, and also because this is for students, they get to know professors outside of the classroom and what they do outside of just hearing their lectures and things like that.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you guys are doing this and finding different ways for us to connect. I know we were both very thrilled to be invited because connecting with students outside the classroom is something that we're both very passionate about, but it can be really hard to do because I know that sometimes we can be a bit intimidating, although I don't really know why. But
I think it's the doctor before the name. But yeah, I just would like to start off with both of you just giving a little bit background, something about you guys that students don't know, something like that.
Ooh, okay. So background, fun fact about me, I have a flock of chickens at home. I actually live on a homestead about 45 minutes outside of London. And so we keep bees and we have chickens that lay eggs and we raise pigs for a while, but not anymore because pigs are stubborn and that's hard. But yeah, in the summer when I'm not working, you'll always find me in my garden.
All right. Fun fact about me: I don't have chickens, so that's I guess a point down for me. I like to run. I just completed my first marathon this year,
wow.
Which is very exciting. And I have a golden retriever named Ollie. She keeps me very busy. Yeah, so I guess those are two fun facts about me.
And although Katie doesn't have chickens, she is part of the Hug a Chicken program, which runs at my house.
Yes, I have held a chicken. I'm not very good at it.
No, but my kids thought it was funny. So
yeah.
Are they ferocious at all?
No, chickens are not ferocious. Not our girls.
Okay.
I always see videos of their head stays still, but you can move their body, so it's
Yes, that is true. They're kind of, and when they run, they're quite comical. And because I have 3 kids, all of the chickens have names, and so it's a fun time. Hug a Chicken program.
Yeah.
Well, just to move on a little bit, I just wanted for the students to know, we talked about this last podcast as well. So what are some of the courses that you're teaching? I've already explained it, but maybe give a better insight.
Sure, I can go first. Right now I'm teaching personal determinants of health, which I know you guys talked about, I think, on one of your other podcasts.
Students were thrilled, by the way, for your teaching.
Thank you, that's so kind. So yeah, it's a first-year mandatory course in the School of Health Studies, and I've previously taught palliative and end-of-life care, which is a 4th-year course.
Fantastic course.
I teach childhood and adolescence health and illness, which is the 2nd year 2700 course. And then I also teach, right now I teach an introduction to rural communities, which is a 3rd year course offered in the fall. And then in the winter term, I teach a special topics course, which is a maternal child health, which currently isn't a permanent course on the books, but we're hoping to get it switched over.
So in your course, 2700, which I'm going to link to your research in a second, there was one point where we spoke about IPV, and of course we're going to get into a lot of detail today, but when I heard IPV for the first time, I didn't think it was that big of a deal. Of course I'm not trying to downplay it. I thought it just doesn't happen that much anymore. And one of the reasons I really wanted to get both of you guys on is I hope this podcast might teach people in the future to not to decrease IPV. If they know what the problems are, maybe they can in their own mind internalize and I shouldn't do this or that. So just can we give a little bit of explanation of what IPV is?
Yeah, so IPV stands for intimate partner violence, and it's a form of gender-based violence. And we tend to think, when we think about violence in the context of relationships, we tend to think of it as a problem that doesn't really happen. And that's partly because it makes us feel more comfortable, right? If we can think of it as another person's problem or a problem that really just exists somewhere else in the world, then we feel better about ourselves. But we actually know that this is not true. Here in Canada, the prevalence rate for intimate partner violence is actually around 40%, which is really, really high, which means women particularly have a 40% chance, or 40% of women will experience intimate partner violence at some point in their lives, whether that's when they're younger, like dating violence, or when they're maybe in more long-term relationships, or whether it is when they're older. And so it is a really significant problem, and we really need to care about it, not only because it's a significant health problem in that it impacts so many people, but there are also a lot of long-term health consequences of violence. And the research has really established this quite well. We see this in terms of like physical, some of the things that you would think of if somebody was maybe in a violent relationship, like bruises or broken bones. But we also see consequences longer term in things like mental health, where people have depression or post-traumatic stress injury. And then those consequences, as I'm sure as health studies students you would know, when you've got those health consequences that start to layer on one on top of another, they're going to impact all avenues and aspects of your life.
One of the stats that really scared me was about 80% of people who experience IPV have been sexually assaulted as a child. That's a very, very scary stat.
It is a very scary stat, and it's one of those things that sometimes when relationships exist, we don't always understand why. But when we know that relationship is so strong, it gives us things to look for. It gives us points in care and points in the broader healthcare system where we can think about maybe we ought to be intervening because it happens so often.
I think something that's really important to highlight is that intimate partner violence doesn't always manifest as something that's physical. It's not like bones and bruises and stuff like that, but it can also be sexual violence, emotional abuse, and other things like that can be affected in the relationship.
Yeah, it can take many different forms. Like you mentioned, physical abuse is probably one that is most common, or what comes to mind when you think about IPV. But as you mentioned, it can be emotional. In many cases, it's financial. So a lot of women that we've talked to and that we research don't have access to their finances, or there's some type of course of control over them where they can't access their finances as well. So it can certainly take lots of different forms.
Question I have, is it an onset or is it a progressive thing? Does it get worse and worse as it goes on? Do their bank accounts start getting taken from them? They can't go here. They can't hang out with her friends and stuff. Is that how it usually goes?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. So we can think about it in terms of cycles of abuse that we know happens. So the cycle is hard, and it can be hard to understand because it's not a definite pattern in that not all women or men are going to experience the same way. So it doesn't always necessarily this progression from nothing to something, or it doesn't always 100% get worse over time. Sometimes things change, and so it's really hard. We can make generalizations, and the generalization is that typically there's a time where nothing happens, and by and large the relationship would look the same as any other person's relationship, right? Where you're sort of getting along and everything's going well, and then there's usually a moment or some events where tension starts to build. When we've talked to women, they talk about, I can sense it coming on, I can feel it happening. And then there's typically an event, so that explosive actual event where it happens, and then there's a cooling off period, or a period where there's lots of remorse. I'm sorry, I love you, this will never happen again. Maybe there's gifts, those types of things.
Love bombing?
Yeah, exactly. And so you see this cycle, but it's not the same for everyone. It's not like we can say this is exactly what happens and this is exactly what will happen, but that's probably a pretty good characterization. And a lot of women do report that it can get worse over time. But again, hard because we don't want to create too many generalizations.
Is the research, does there a lack of research at all?
There's actually a lot of really amazing research happening in this area. There's a lot of dedicated researchers here at Western. We've got two sort of leading experts, Dr. Ford Gilbo in the School of Nursing and Dr. Wathen in the School of Nursing. She used to be in FIMS, who are big Canadian researchers for domestic violence or intimate partner violence, gender-based violence. We also have, I'm part of a team here in Canada that's doing research across the country. So we've got partners in BC as well as partners partners out east, and there's a national conference and community that we're a part of, and in VAWI, that's working to do more research in this area and work collaboratively. So I wouldn't say there's a lack of research. I think we need more research, and especially I think in light of COVID, it's really come to the surface.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so you're talking a lot about the research that you do, and before we started this podcast, we got to look at the different researches that you've done, and we've noticed that a lot of your research surrounds like issues in women's health and well-being. So why do you think that promoting women's health is so important within like healthcare, and what really keeps you motivated in like these research projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll talk about what keeps me motivated, and then Katie, if you want to jump in. So the reason I care about women's health is because we all came from a woman, which means that it matters to all of us, whether you wanted to or not, but that's the reality. And we've spent so long studying men's health, and I think that that's so important, but historically we have overlooked women's health. And so women's health to me is something that's really important, just like when we think about health in, minority populations or equity deserving groups. We need to study it in all those different areas in order to make sure that we're using those sort of best possible of it.
What do you find that's important within women's health?
To echo some of the points that Tara said, it's really important in general, and I like knowing that the research that we do makes a difference and contributes to something bigger than ourselves. And when we get to talk to women who've experienced violence, it makes it like really real, and we're seeing their strength, their resilience, how they're coping, things like that. So I think that's kind of what keeps me going, keeps me motivated, and yeah.
In your research, we're going to get into the coping strategies in a second. Is there any other research that would help men to understand how to prevent it, or know personally, I like to think no one is all bad. I feel like, of course, it's very wrong for men to do that, but I feel like some men are also uneducated. Maybe they feel like they saw it outside and that's how they think that's a way of dealing with the issue. Is there any research to teach men how to prevent IPV?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of research that's going in, particularly with younger children as well as in adolescents, about healthy relationships. So there was a health promotion campaign a while back, and it was the 4 R's of healthy relationships, respect, and there were 3 other R's. I should probably know those. I think I taught those at one point. But for a lot of us, the schemes that we have, the way that what we would see as acceptable in a relationship has a lot to do with what we saw when we were growing up, what we saw when we were little. And so it's about making sure that people understand what healthy relationships are and what they look like, and where is that line, what is abuse, and how do we make sure that people sort of understand that, because I think that's part of it. The other part of it sometimes has to do with tempers and control and controlling behaviors, and that's more where the IPV comes in. It's not necessarily just violence as a means of like a communication tool, like a really poor communication tool, etc., but in intimate partner violence, the point of the violence is to control someone's behavior. And that's where that line is. And that's where we need to really think carefully about how do we support women to become safe, or to be safe in those relationships. And oftentimes they know exactly what they need. We just need to have those resources widely available to them. And then sometimes it's about helping them to identify the relationships that they're in. In terms of the research with men and like rehabilitation, there's some really good work that's being done out of a few different areas. There's some work that's being done around Sarnia area and then up north. It's not something that I'm super familiar with. My research really tends to focus on the women.
Yeah, I don't have too much more to add to that. I can't really speak to men's perspective as well, because, we research more women.
Why is one of the biggest things that you found in your research self-blaming from the woman when she is being abused?
Yeah, so when you think about abuse, there's an erosion of self-esteem, right? If you're told every day lies about yourself, that you're not worthy, that you're not good enough, that you're not smart enough, what happens is that becomes internalized, right? It just becomes your new belief system. When you think about this erosion of self-esteem over the period of months or years, then there becomes blame around that, right? If I'm not good enough, and that's what everyone's telling me, or that's what my significant other is telling me, that becomes internalized. internalized, which then women do tend to start blaming themselves for the things that they're experiencing. You know, if I could have just done something slightly differently, if I could have just done something slightly better, then this wouldn't have happened. When in actual reality, she doesn't have any control over it, and nobody deserves to be abused, regardless of whether, you know, the dinner table is set on time or not.
Is self-blaming linked to a lack of police filings? Is that at all?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think so. I would wager not, again. So I think when we think about whether or not women disclose abuse to police, you have to think about what the intention is, as well as what the need is. So when your people are reaching out to police, what is it that they want police to do? We also know that historically and currently, policing services are not always well equipped to support women, right? They're supposed to be a frontline emergency service, and while there's these moments of emergency, their ability to step in and support that's not the design or the function necessarily of the police service. I think women tend to underreport or not report to police, one, because they don't want police services, or two, because they feel better equipped to handle it themselves, or three, they could be concerned about the response that they're going to get. So if you're reaching out for help and you don't get help, then you're less likely to reach out for help. Or if you know a friend who's reached out for help and they didn't get the help that they needed, but rather, you know, got undermined or discriminated against, then you're not going to reach out to, because you would assume it would be the same experience. The other piece of reporting is when you report something, you're admitting that it's happened. A lot of women that we've talked to have felt like they were failed at their relationship, or that they were a failure because of this. And so there's that piece. I think it's really nuanced, and it sort of all wraps and winds together. But I don't know that I necessarily see a connection between those two. I think the underreporting is just sort of nuanced by a bunch of other issues.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I was like listening to a different podcast a couple of days ago that was talking about domestic violence reportings and police, and they were saying how recently the percentage of women who are police has gone up, and along with that, the rate of like incoming calls and like for like domestic abuse has also been going up. And they say that they could like guess that the correlation was because more women in the police force allows for like other women to reach out and feel more accepted, and that, or also because they feel like sometimes men might undermine their problems as well,
Yeah.
which is why they're like underreported.
Absolutely. And a lot of police forces now have specialized units, and some of them have specialized training, and some of them are, and hopefully, you know, in the perfect world, those would be working really closely with shelters and community, right? So I think we're starting to see a shift, but like all system shifts, it takes time.
Where do you think the trajectory of IPV is going? Do you think in the future it'll be lower, higher, stagnant? What do you guys hope?
It's a big question. I mean, I think we all hope that it would be lower, and hopefully with, you know, more research and more education, that prevalence would be lower. It's a big question because it's such a systemic question. You know, not everyone has access to the same education, to the same resources. In the work that we do, there's the difference between urban communities and rural communities, and just even that, there's a lot of differences. So there's a lot of things I think to take into account. So I don't know that I can blanket statement whether like the direction, but maybe Tara can weigh in.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer, Katie. I also think we know during COVID it got worse.
We'll get into that in a second.
It got worse. And that's the current trajectory. And I mean, I think we all like to imagine that COVID is over, but COVID is very much not over. And so we've seen this spike, and I think it'll take a while for us to determine whether we're going to stay at that level, whether we're going to see a reduction, like what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of like COVID, we can jump into the first research paper that we're going to talk about. It's called The Impacts of COVID-19 on the Coping Mechanisms of Canadian Women Experiencing Intimate Partner Violence. If you guys want to give like a brief overview of like what entailed in that study and what you found, things like that.
Sure, yeah. So we conducted, it was a mixed method study, so it included both qualitative and quantitative components, and we were interested in looking at the coping strategies of women who were experiencing violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think there were 95 women, if I'm remembering the numbers correctly, who participated in the quantitative component, so a survey component where we had measured IPV as well as coping through 2 different scales. And then we had a qualitative component as well where we interviewed 29, 25, 27, 29 women. Hard to keep all the studies straight.
There's 19 on
19.
Zoom.
All right, 19. There we go.
We do our research over here.
Yeah, and so we had asked them different questions with regards to what coping looked like for them during the pandemic and how the pandemic had impacted their relationships and what changes and whatnot had impacted their relationships. And we found a lot of different things. I don't know that it was really surprising. I think we had anticipated, unfortunately, that there would be a rise in IPV during COVID, and as a result, it did impact women mostly negatively.
Just a side note question. How difficult was it to conduct a study as a woman, seeing these women go through that?
Oh, I think when you're passionate about what you're doing, that helps. And so when you think about the statistics that like between 33 and 40% of women, depending on which stats you're following, have experienced IPV, you have to realize that in the number of women, if I think about the number of women that I know, so like right now there are 4 women sitting at this table. Stats would indicate that at least one of us at some point in our life, like that's so eye-opening and shocking, and I think that's what drives the research. And so while I think it's hard, there's also, in all the interactions that we have with women, most of them want to share their stories. They want to help other women. They want to help other women to not be in the same situations or find better ways for systems to support women to get out of situations. And so that sort of positive, that light is what drives the research that we're doing, and also just the gratitude that we have for women who are willing to share their stories with us. And all of our research is really grounded in participatory action or integrated models where we are trying to change the systems. And so I think that helps as well, knowing that I'm not just studying this because I'm interested in it, but rather we want to see real change.
Does it ever feel like you're going against the tide, like pushing a boulder up a rock or a cliff? Does it ever feel like that?
I would say in the early days when I was an early researcher, maybe, but I've surrounded myself by just amazing researchers and amazing women it's mostly women who are doing work in this area. And so anytime where it starts to feel hard or challenging, it's really great to be able to reach out and be like, hey, let's grab a coffee. Or, reading the interviews and realizing the impact that we're having on women's lives and just how important it is to continue to share their message and their voice. I think that always helps.
Yeah. Reading about your research, and I thought it was really great how, especially like the Zoom component where they got to talk to other people about their experiences, that was like a really great outlet for them as well. Like they've probably been like a lot of them have been holding it in and being in like these relationships, and not having other people to talk about it with, especially during COVID. So this was really great, I guess.
Yeah, we were able to conduct the interviews over Zoom or over the telephone. So for many women, because of COVID, there was, as you know, a lot of shutdowns. They weren't able to access the same resources that they were able to. So it's definitely possible that, in talking to us, they were able to perhaps say some of the things for the first time or acknowledge some things for the first time during COVID, for sure.
This might be a little bit of a difficult question to answer. For women or like the people listening to this podcast, hopefully no one ever experiences IPV. But if they do, any coping strategies or any like just one-liner advice do you have for them?
Yeah, I would say we have some amazing resources. The ANOVA here in London is absolutely phenomenal. And that just because you call or reach out doesn't mean you have to actually go there, or it doesn't mean anything. It's just the ability to get help. And they would be best positioned to help you. They support women all over this community and have successfully for a very long period of time. And I can personally vouch for them. They are fabulous humans. And so my advice would be reach out and get help. It's like any crisis or like anything anyone's facing, right? Facing it alone is really hard. As soon as you start facing it with other people who are better positioned to help you, things get easier, right? Things always get easier in a group.
I think, sorry, Esther. I think saying alone was a very key point because, of course, I don't experience this, but just having just putting my mind in their shoes, or putting walking a mile in their shoes. I could just imagine the isolation of not having your own finances, the physical, the factors, the emotional factors, and just not having a group. Because and part of your research, you did say even if they have a social coping mechanisms, they don't feel as connected. So like I could just imagine like the figurative stranglehold you could feel. It's very, very scary.
Yeah, you mentioned like financial coping, and in the research, it said that financial coping was like one of the key like strategies of coping that was really important to the women. And that was like really eye-opening because I didn't expect that to be one. I didn't know what it meant, but it's basically like having autonomy over your own money. So like not being financially dependent on other people or like on your abuser, and that really made a big difference. And I guess that was really eye-opening for me because I didn't realize how much of an impact that really does have. Having to like be able to like leave a situation is also like really heavily dependent on money, I guess. So
Yeah, I think the financial piece is really big, and it's definitely something that we've seen in our other work as well. And I know, you know, it's maybe not something that comes to mind when you think of abuse or you think of IPV. And in talking to women, you know, we heard that they'll be at the grocery checkout line and they'll notice that there's not any money in their account, like their partner hadn't transferred their weekly allowance to buy groceries, things like that we don't really, you know, maybe think about. And so hearing them talk about, you know, the strength that they have and the joy that they have in having their own finances and having their own autonomy. A lot of the women, you know, are building their own businesses or you know, just doing things that, you know, help to build their resilience, help them to cope. I think is really amazing.
Why is there such a high dependence on substance abuse in rural communities as a coping mechanism by rural women?
Yeah, so I'd classify it as substance use, not substance
Sorry,
abuse.
yeah,
Yeah, no,
sorry,
because I think with abuse we cast our own judgments, and
Yeah.
substance use is like until you've walked a mile in someone else's shoes, I'm not really in a position to judge. And I think part of it is we see it in urban communities as well, but in terms of rural communities, there can be less resources, right? So when you think about a rural community, it might only have, you know, one primary healthcare provider, or it might not even have a shelter. Maybe the closest shelter is 3 communities over. And that lack of resources or the lack of connection or even more social isolation might mean that one of the only coping strategies that this woman has or that she has autonomy over might be the use of substance. And I think it's important that we stay out of a place of judgment on that, because again, until you've walked what she's walked and faced what she's faced, any coping that keeps her in a good space or keeps her going, I always think is good coping.
yeah, and like being able to read in the paper, you guys put in like quotations of like direct things that they've said, and I think that like gives the readers like a better experience of what they're actually feeling in the moment, rather than just like reading somebody's like paraphrasing of what they were trying to get across.
Moving on to COVID, I mean, it's always going to be a conversation starter. How did that impact IPV? Just like a beginning, like, did it make it, of course, I would say more spike, right? You guys are isolated into a home.
Yeah. It did, absolutely. We saw an increase in incidence and prevalence as well as severity of IPV during
severity.
COVID. Because when you think about it, COVID was this really stressful situation, particularly when we did this research, which was early days COVID. And so we were still doing those lockdowns, and there was so much uncertainty, right? If you think back to your, 2020 self, when, everything shut down and nobody knew what was going on those days, when we were Lysoling groceries, wearing gloves because we just didn't know. And so in that time, that creates a huge amount of stress on a relationship, not to mention all the unemployment that went along with that. And we know financial stress is a significant sort of indicator or moderator of violence. The more stress that is felt, typically the more violence that we see. And so we saw this explosion or higher levels of violence. And in talking with women and shelters and directors, they talked about seeing it at rates that they've never seen, and seeing it at severity, and seeing severities that they hadn't seen in a Canadian context.
It spoke about hotels as an alternative housing. We all know the hotel laws that happened, and I could just imagine how chaotic it could be. Could you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so in work that I did with Dr. Wathen's team, we talked to shelters and we talked to women and frontline service providers to just try to understand the way that services were changing and responding to COVID. And one of the mandates was the physical distancing and specifically around congregate living. And so one of the rules is that people couldn't share bathrooms anymore. Well, in shelters, it's usually a couple bedrooms and they share a bathroom. And so that effectively cut shelter occupancy rates by significant percentage. I think some of the research from that team was like 60 to 70% space loss. And so one of the alternates that was put forward was hotels, right? Hotels. And so they would pay for hotels and women to go to hotels. And while that provides a physical safe place in that the woman is not home, what we found in speaking with women as well as service providers is that there was a real tension, right? There were really things that were really good about it. Some of the women really liked the autonomy of living in the hotel. They didn't have to conform to shelter rules. They could really come and go a little bit more as they pleased, whereas in those early stages of lockdown in shelters, it was a bit more tight. But they also talked about maybe not always feeling safe at shelters, right? So at hotels rather. So a shelter has a locked door. It's secure access. There's somebody who watches who's in and out. At a shelter, there's none. At a hotel, there's none. And when you think about this in rural communities, sometimes the rural hotel is actually a rural motel. And that motel might not be in the best part of town. And so you've got women who are trying to, stay at a hotel or a motel with children to be in a safe space, and there's, drug deals happening right outside the door. They don't feel safe to leave the place at night. But it was it's hard to say sort of the value or not value. I mean, in some ways, hotels and motels were useful in that women weren't turned away from shelter, which would have been really problematic. There was some safety concerns. There was concerns around whether they got sufficient programming and support or whether they were sort of just left out there. The bottom line is in those early days of COVID, it was really presented as the only option. So it wasn't really an option. It was kind of like, we need to make the best of this. And I think that what research will continue to sort of nuance in the future is was that good enough, or do we need a different plan for future pandemics?
Mm-hmm. And you briefly mentioned about like the different options that they have. It's like with COVID and the restrictions that they have, you can either like continue staying in a violent home with your abuser, or you could go and find a shelter, which there's limited occupancy, of course, or use a hotel. So that really doesn't leave many options. Other than that, face homelessness, which is like even more severe. So, yeah.
As we just talked about financial abuse, you never talked about the cost of hotels. Was that also another wrench in the system?
Yeah, because I'm reading about the article, the cost of hotels obviously are really high, especially like renting out multiple rooms for multiple nights at a time. Is there like any funding that was like gave to like support this?
Yeah, there was funding. I don't know exactly how that worked. I don't know that I ever asked that question, but I know that it was covered. So women didn't have to cover it, and I think shelters probably got additional money or support to cover that. Most of the time they had sort of blocks of rooms that were set aside. Because the other thing you need to remember is people weren't staying in hotels and motels during COVID. Like there was no travel, there was no, conferences, etc. So there was more vacancy in hotels. So they were more willing to house women for the most part.
Was there ever like a situation where like they can't accept any more people and there aren't any hotel spaces and they would have to turn down women?
That's a really good question. So when we talked with directors, we talked about the triaging, right? So what do they do if it's a small rural community and there's only so many spaces available and there's only so many spaces in the shelter? And so they would triage the most sort of high risk cases would come into shelter because there's more of those like safety measures and mechanisms, where some of the quote unquote lower risk were sent out into community. I didn't hear in talking with shelters any instances where people were just completely turned away. I think the one really amazing thing about women's shelters is they are very industrious. They are very passionate about what they do, and they seem to always find a way to make it work. And fortunately, they find a way to make it work with less and less resources, which which means service is great for women. The stress level on providers is really high, unfortunately. So I didn't hear of any of those instances. I'd be interested to know if it actually happened. I suspect it probably did somewhere. Just when we make these policy level decisions, it's sometimes those unintended consequences that we just don't think about.
I like how you bring up industrious. My sister works at a women's shelter, the women that have dementia, and she tells me all the time, like, we might not have a lot of resources, but we get it done. Of course, it's very sad. She comes home sometimes like crying, of course, but she's like, I love going, just helping out. We're very industrious. She says that all the time, like, we get it done no matter what.
Yeah, most of these organizations do because they're passionate. They're passionate people who work there.
In a perfect world, just your opinion, what would you want, like what mechanisms you want in place? How would you like this issue to be fixed?
Yeah, what would I like? I think the best way to fix this is through prevention, through not having women in violent relationships and making sure that everybody understands healthy relationships. I think in terms of, I think that would be the best outcome, to be honest. I think there's so much work that we need to do in helping to support and bring that to reality, but that would be prevention, and I think it's a tune that we all sing across these healthcare classes or these health studies classes, right? Prevention is worth a pound of cure. So if we prevent it, it's just easier in the long run.
Yeah, and I think that's something we've also like heard from women as well when we ask them, what they hope for the future, what they're a lot of women say education and educating, making people aware, so that other women don't face similar experiences as them.
So back to the first study around coping strategies, one of the questions that I had was basically a lot of the work was done around coping and resilience and well-being. And as health sci students, like, we take a whole course on resilience and well-being. And so what's something that you, while conducting the study, is there anything that you noticed or learned about resilience within the women who had to regularly practice it?
I mean, I think we found that women are very resilient by nature, and a lot of them talked about inner strength and the strength that they relied on themselves, as well as the strength that for those of them that are mothers, the strength that they get from their children as well. And I know you, Tara, has some things on the resilience in this endemic as well that we noted. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's really great to hear, because it's just so hard, and it's frustrating reading these articles because, like, you're like learning about other women's and their experiences, and you're reading and you're thinking, I'm so grateful that this doesn't happen to me, at least. And so yeah,
but that's why having these important conversations are so important. And I know we were so grateful to be invited to be able to use this platform, because I think the more we talk about some of those things, especially those hard things, the better it will be, right? It's when we don't talk about it, or when we cover it up, or when we, don't shed light on it, that things get perpetuated. So I think platforms like this and opportunities like this, we're just so grateful for, and they're so important.
We're very happy to have you guys on. On average, can you shed light on how, like, severe it is? Like, is that anything you can talk about?
It just depends on the relationship. And I think I think most severe would obviously be like femicide, when the woman's been killed. But severity is one of those things. We've got metrics, and we've sort of create hierarchies, and we can watch or count or frequencies, etc. But the health consequences are really by and large the same, right? And so severity, while it's important, it doesn't always tell the whole story.
What's like your inspiration behind your research? Like, how do you come up with, like, I want to study hotels and intimate partner violence? Is there like some kind of like moment where you're like, I'm sparked with an idea and then I want to like figure this out? What's like the process, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. So all of our research is typically born out of the previous study, to be honest. So we always ask women, whatever is our research question. And one of the questions that we typically follow up with is, is there anything else you'd like us to know, or anything else that's important, or future directions, or things that you think we should change? And then when we compile those, we typically go, oh my goodness, that's the next research question. And so it's really driven by women. We use a type of research, or type of qualitative research, that's interpretive description, which means the design is changing practice. And so we use exactly what women say and we feed that back in. Or when women say something and we go, we don't really understand that, we don't really see that in the literature, then we would create that. So all of research is really driven by participants and driven by what are the gaps that we need to fill to make it better.
What do you think the best form of getting this information out? Like, for primary research, not the whole population can read. It is a more difficult English level of writing. Also, it does get lost in translation when it goes to secondary. What do you think is the best? Do you think it's through video format, podcasting? I mean, of course, all of it together is the best. But if you had to choose one, what would be like the big push of getting it out to the masses?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think it depends on what the purpose of the message is. So when we have a research study with a bunch of findings, we think about who needs to know this and at what point, and then we tailor the message and we tailor the medium. So if I'm giving a presentation, say to a board of directors, that presentation is going to look very different than if I'm doing a podcast. Or if I'm doing an event with stakeholders at like a women's shelter, that's going to look very different than if I'm talking to women who've experienced it. And so I think in terms of knowledge mobilization, the best plan is to figure out who needs to know it and why. Why is it important to them? What's our target audience? And then matching those things together. That's usually where we find the most success.
Yeah, I would have to echo on those points there. I know we've given different presentations, and it looks different based on who we're talking to, whether it's, researchers or an academic community versus women in shelter versus whoever it might be, students, etc. So yeah, mapping it would probably be the best strategy.
Do you think one of the most effective ways is teaching young adults? University students, high school, both men and women?
I'm obviously a firm believer in education, or I wouldn't be a professor. But yeah, I think the more we can educate people, the better. I think it's, in terms of intervention, it's the easiest, or it's not necessarily the easiest, but it is the most effective and cost effective. And not to mention that I think, like you said, people are innately good and people innately want to do better. And so I think helping everybody to do better is helping everybody to know more and know what to look for, signs that you might see in your relationship or others people's relationship, and helping people to know what to do in those instances.
Mm-hmm. What made you guys want to pursue a career in academia? Katie, I know that you're doing your PhD right now. Yeah. And before you were also a health sci student. So what was kind of the transition where you wanted to go on to a PhD rather than other options?
She met me. No, I'm joking.
Yeah, I did have the pleasure of taking courses with Tara.
What course did you take?
You used to teach a lot of aging courses.
I
so
do. That's terrifying. That's memory lane. Let's not go there.
Yeah, I took some aging courses. I did my undergrad, master's, and now PhD at Western, so they just can't get rid of me.
We bleed purple. Yes.
Yeah. And I think to answer your question, in terms of getting involved in research, I think I met the right people, and I worked on Tara's team and on Jen's team as well, and so I was exposed to research in my undergrad, and thought I would do my master's, and here we are, haven't left. So
do you ever get burnt out, or
I think everybody can get burnt out in whatever profession or whatever they're doing, is if they don't have a good healthy balance of different things. I mean, I try to all the things we learn in health sci, get exercise, do what you need to do for mental and physical health, and hopefully avoid burnout.
I think also I see burnout in lots of areas of my professional life. Where I don't usually see it is in the research side. So in talking to women, in reading transcripts and doing focus groups and interviews and even cleaning data, which can be a bit mundane. There's a lot of passion there, and I know the importance of it. And so I find that really rejuvenating. I feel quite excited to keep going. And so I think even though it's a really hard topic and it's a heavy topic and it can feel a bit overwhelming at times, I think holding on to that light is usually what most researchers in this area, what drives us.
Quick fire question. Research or teaching?
Oh. I feel like if I say research, that's awkward because you're all in my class right now. Can I say?
The truth. You gotta say the truth.
Oh, I would. You know what? At this point, because it's November and exams are looming, and that's stressful, even for me, I'll say research. But if you catch me in September, I say teaching. It probably depends on the day, to be honest.
I'm probably the same. I'm the same. Yeah.
You ever don't want to talk to students, just be in your own bubble of research?
I think if I get super focused on a project, I could get a little bit. I mean, but that's just me. I feel like sometimes I don't know who I am or where I'm going. I think that's true of most academics at some point. But I genuinely love students. I like watching you guys learn. I like watching the way that you guys think, and I like thinking about ways that I can hopefully change the way that you're thinking about things. And for me, watching those aha moments or those moments where a student really gets it, that's the best. That is the absolute best.
Yeah. In your childhood and adolescence class, it was like a couple of weeks ago. I remember class had just finished, and I was overhearing these two girls behind me. She's like, I just gotta go and call my mom and say thank you. So I'm like, wow. Yeah.
After learning what it takes to raise a kid, I called my mom, like, you did a great job. You did a really great job.
Yay! I've accomplished all I need to then.
So, what's your favorite course you teach? 2700, 3010, favorite course?
My favorite course, I would say, oh man, what's the viewership like on this? Is it mostly first?
We're at an uptick. It keeps getting more and more.
Oh no. So I'm gonna cheat. I like 2700 because the energy in that room, 400 people. You guys seem to genuinely care, which is a really cool energy. I also like 3010 though because it's
3010 is my favorite.
And it's a small group, and we get to have super just great discussions.
What's the name of that course?
Introduction to Rural Communities, and it's fabulous. Tell everybody.
Amazing. Remember my presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. It's,
best presentation ever.
See, they're so great, but we get to have better conversations in third and fourth year classes, and I really like that. But I like it all.
Yeah, I mean, I don't teach nearly as many classes as Tara, but I mean, I'm teaching 1001. The students, there's a lot of them, but they're a good group, and so it's fun to be able to introduce students to new topics, and for many of them, it's their first year in university, maybe even their first course when they take it. So it's a neat position to be in, and I really enjoy it.
Would you rather teach first years or fourth years?
I've only taught first years once before, so I'd have to say fourth years just because I don't usually teach first years.
What would you like, first years or fourth years?
Probably first years right now.
How many classes do you guys usually have to teach in a semester?
So it depends. A normal workload for a faculty member is 3 courses.
That's a lot.
3 courses a year,
Okay.
So we usually do a 2-1 split because we also have teaching would be considered graduate students, carrying graduate students or working with graduate students. But there are some faculty members who teach 7 a year because they're more of a teaching intensive faculty member, and so it really it just depends on what sort of your designation is.
What did you learn from teaching?
Did I learn from teaching? That's a great question. I learned that teaching is a lot easier if students are bought in or engaged, and that's my job as a teacher. That's my job is I need to try with a hook to catch you, to get you to want to care. And whether that's using anecdotes, or I've done games in smaller classes, or I've had dramas and all sorts of crazy things, anything to get you in. Because once you're in, the teaching is easy and the learning is easy. But I find the hook is important.
Yeah, you're taking all the good answers.
That's why I talk first.
Yeah. I know. I think, engagement is such a key piece, and I'm definitely earlier on in my career than Tara. So what I've learned thus far... Oh, that's a tough question.
I know. They've got good, hard questions.
Yeah, it is a really hard question.
Professional here. We're very professional.
You guys have got it.
I mean, I think what I've learned is a lot of students, they want to do well, they want to learn, and they're here to learn, and it's cool to play just even a small piece in that. So knowing that, we're shaping people's minds and their knowledge in different areas is a really cool feeling.
One other thing that I've found, because I've taken both of you guys' courses, you guys have a very similar teaching method, is you bring energy into the room. Now, I've had the class with Dr. Shillington through online, and that is challenging to even get some energy. And I was engaged. I was looking forward to every class. Please, guys, email the dean for 4710. But even for your childhood course and your 3010 course, you guys bring an energy where it makes it easy to get engaged. The content, of course, is interesting. Even if it was a mundane content, you guys don't come on the mic, so hi guys, just like mundane. I feel like when a prof comes in with energy and actually is passionate and wants to teach, instead of just like, oh, I have to do this for research, like those type of things. When they actually want to mold the student's mind, it really translates to the student being engaged, wanting to listen, wanting to learn. Like I still have lessons from 3010 that I remember to this day. Most kids just forget after the semester.
Yeah, thank you. That's lovely.
Yeah, it's always like the small examples that you guys bring into classes. That's what I've noticed in like all my previous classes, when they give maybe personal examples of things that they've done, and I always end up thinking back to them. It's really interesting.
Yeah, your personal examples were the ones I always remember. If I'm thinking about a slide or something, oh, what did she say here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it helps it to come alive. And it makes it more entertaining for us too, I think.
For sure.
What tips would you guys give to help students, for all the listeners, to help succeed in your classes?
I think, taking care of yourself is the first thing that I always tell students. So making sure that you take breaks in your studies and whatnot, in order to do well. I mean, I'm a big fan of concept maps, and I think Tara got me on that when I was in undergrad. So in terms of study methods, that's definitely one that I use in order to bring a lot of concepts together. So I would say in order to, or one of the ways to do well maybe in my courses would be to be able to connect the concepts and be able to apply the material is really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's I am a big fan of, if you can see the bigger picture, it makes the small pieces easier. If you see where the whole thing is going and you have a general understanding of that, usually the small pieces you can sort of figure out. I would also say when you come to class, be prepared to learn. And if you're not, then don't come. And I'm not saying that from a place of judgment. I'm saying that from a place of we all have days where we're not in a place. And so don't bring yourself there. Don't bring yourself to class, because it's not going to go well. You're not going to feel good, and you're going to end up more stressed out. And I think we're doing a better job. The university is doing a better job. I think just generally the world is doing a better job at realizing that we all have off days and we all need downtime, and mental health is so important, and taking those breaks is so important. And so those are my biggest, because I feel like once you get it in your head that you don't understand something, it's really hard to get rid of that or shake that feeling.
I have one more question. You're free not to answer. Has being a mother helped you better be a teacher, or has teacher helped you be a better mother?
Oh, I think it probably works both ways. I think being a mom teaching 2700 makes it a bit easier, because I can use examples with my kids, especially for some of the more abstract concepts. And I think that makes me a better teacher, because I think it's easier for students to relate. I think it probably also, being a teacher, makes me a better mom. I like to think maybe I have a little bit more patience, although I don't know, a 2-year-old with a temper tantrum, does anybody have any patience? So I think it probably worked a little bit both ways.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it was really nice having you guys on, and I'm sure the listeners will really appreciate getting to hear more about the professors and the faculty.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah,
it's been great.
This has been fabulous, and I can't wait to actually listen to this podcast and all of them and see where you guys are going to take this, because you guys are doing such an amazing job.
Thank
I'm
you.
so
Thank
excited.
you.
So
Thank
great.
you.
Thanks,
We're
guys.
truly grateful for you guys coming on, spending your time. I know it was difficult. Just you guys have crazy schedules, of course. Thank you for guys coming on. It's been the Apple Podcast. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.